Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to NewsTalk, a news show that tackles the big stories of the day and asks the questions that you want to be answered. We kick off today by looking at the government's Nationality and Borders Bill, asking is the government really proposing to strip British citizenship without notice? And a day after the deaths of so many migrants in the Channel, discussing nationality and borders has perhaps never been more important. Joining me today in the studio is Tasnim Akanji, a criminal defence solicitor. And joining me by the wonders of digital technology, Maya Foa, the Joint Executive Director of Reprieve, a non-governmental organisation who challenge human rights abuses in court. And Ella Whelan, a freelance journalist, commentator and author of the book, What Women Want, Fun, Freedom and an End to Feminism. Well, Maya, I'm going to start with you, if you don't mind, Maya, first, and ask you a simple question, which is, what is this bill?
An extremely wide-ranging attack on large groups of people. It's got so many noxious provisions that I'll focus on a couple of them. One of the things that you rightly pointed out up top that it seeks to do is to expand the powers that the government, and in particular the Home Secretary, have to strip people of citizenship without needing to tell them that they have done so. Another provision seeks to create a carve-out so that you cannot be considered a victim of trafficking if the group that trafficked you was a terrorist organisation. So there are some really problematic provisions. There are also, of course, some awful clauses around migration, immigration, and in light of the real tragedy yesterday, I think it's even more pertinent that we have this conversation today. So thank you.
Yeah. But in terms of the first point that you raised about having your nationality stripped away from you, I mean, this is quite a big thing, but I suppose obviously it's not something that's just been dreamt up today, though, is it? It's something that the government's really had the ability to do this for over a century.
Well, that's absolutely right. And so then one might question, why now are we trying to expand their powers? Because as it stood before they introduced this new clause, the government was able to strip citizenship on really broad range of, bases, justifications, pseudo-justifications sometimes. And all they had to do to tell you they had done it was send a notice to your last known address, in the same way that your bank might send a notice to your last known address, your parking ticket that you haven't paid, that will go to your last known address. But the government is saying with this new clause that they can't be expected to even send the notice to the last known address. So it's intriguing to me, given that they already had such wide-reaching powers, which they have been exercising in a quite dramatic and draconian way recently, that they're now seeking to avoid accountability for those powers altogether. So it's sort of unchecked power that might well result in people being unable then to appeal, which, with a regime that already lacks any kind of, many of the fundamentals of good justice, that prohibition or the impediment to appeal is unthinkable in a civilized democracy where we respect the rule of law.
Well, Tasnim, let me just bring you in there. Obviously, Maya's just been talking there about the fact that you won't be able to appeal. But I would imagine that most people who would be going through the process in some form or other would be having legal aid, I would imagine, as well. I mean, surely is this just not a continuation of things that have already gone on?
Well, I mean, the government statement talks about having the right to strip people for over 100 years. But between 1948 and 71, nobody was stripped of citizenship at all. And then you had only 10 people up until 7/7 occurred. And the reason that it was so parsimoniously used was, A, the idea of citizenship was very important, and the government recognised that. But also because in order to strip somebody's citizenship prior to this, the government had to show that you were involved in a Guy Fawkes type attempt. Really, you had to show that you were attacking the vital interests or the national interests of the country. After 7/7, that changed to the government being able to strip you on the basis that it's not conducive to the public good, which is a much more wide term. And we really see them ramping this up in 2017, where, as I say, over many years, only 10 people had been stripped, and in 17 it goes up to 150 all of a sudden. So it's not just that it's a particular power, it is, but it's one that's also been rolled out as a policy now. And the issue of not giving somebody notice creates really significant hurdles for somebody to even avail themselves of the rights to the appeal process. At the moment, if you get a notice, you can then rock up to the the SIAC courts, which are the appeal courts that you appeal this decision at, and you've got a piece of paper that says, look, the Home Secretary has made this decision and I have the right to appeal it. Without that piece of paper, if you're off in a refugee camp in Syria, how do you even discover that you've been stripped of citizenship until at some point where you try and board a plane and your passport simply doesn't work? So it creates this administrative barrier that actually, in the context of this sort of the people who are going to be affected by this, it really puts a very, very high barrier up to them being able to remedy it.
And Ella, this all seems a bit mad, doesn't it? It seems a bit very, very strange, as we've heard. It seems like a strange time to do this. The powers were already there. Why do you think the government's bringing it in now?
I think it's most definitely, and I think Maya mentioned this, a political move, which is that at a time when you have a real panic about levels of immigration, and I think at times a really unhinged discussion about the levels of immigration and what we're going to do, and teamed with very real tragedies like the likes of what we saw last night with over 30 people drowning in the Channel crossing. And I think the government is trying to send, or at least the Home Office and Priti Patel is trying to ham-fistedly send some kind of message that they're tough on immigration, that they're taking this seriously. I mean, we know that the Home Office is one shambles of a department, and this new move to remove citizenship without notice smacks of the kind of hostile environment policy that we saw come to such horrendous ends with the Windrush Scandal. I mean, part of the horror of what happened with the Windrush generation was not simply that they had their citizenship stripped or that they were refused it in the first place, but it was this element of kind of the evils of bureaucracy, the fact that they didn't know where they stood. There was a fantastic BBC documentary called Sitting in Limbo, which tracked the real life story of someone who had been through the process. And he was describing the fact that the worst thing wasn't necessarily the judgment or the ruling that he did or didn't have citizenship. It was not knowing what was going on, as Taz described, turning up to offices with no paperwork, not being able to establish where you were in the legal process. And this is, it's an incredibly insidious way of dealing with something as serious as citizenship. And it also begs the question, I mean, that, if these people, let's say, for example, if you're going to be generous to the government, that they're talking about people who are maybe a terror threat or, whatever their excuse is, do those people no longer become the responsibility and the duty of Britain, the UK to deal with? Are they someone else's problem? Do we not understand that things like terrorism, that things like national threat is now a global problem? Why are we just exporting these issues elsewhere? And particularly given the fact that we know when it comes to the specifics of extremism and radicalization, that the vast majority of people who do pose a threat have been born and bred and are fully, and whatever you want to call it, they're British, they're citizens, they were born and raised here. And so this is you use the word mess, it's most definitely a mess, but it's one that has very serious political ramifications.
No, it certainly does, and it has ramifications for people, as you said, on an individual basis. I mean, Maya, Ella there talked about, people, terrorism-related offences, etc., and people who may be abroad and having their citizenship stripped. And one particular case comes to mind, which is the case of, obviously, Shamima Begum. It just seems like, obviously, I can understand, that many people there are many people who sit there and watch the Shamima Begum story and say, well, she has no right to be a British citizen. She turned her back on Britain. We can have a conversation, obviously, about what age she was when she did that. But is this a reaction to what we saw with her and the fact that maybe in polling or whatever they've done, there's been some kind of positive reaction from members of the public to effectively be seen to be tough on individuals such as Shamima Begum?
It's really interesting that you asked that very question, because I spent a long time working on these cases of people detained in northeast Syria and thinking, as you do when you work in a human rights advocacy organisation, of what are the arguments that I need to surmount here? What are the government's good arguments? Why are they adopting this policy that makes no rational sense? And I thought about it and I talked about lots of different issues. And then I realized that actually they don't have any good arguments that I need to surmount. They don't. We know from a security perspective, citizenship stripping and leaving people, in unstable camps in the desert is not good for our national security. It's no good from a human rights perspective. It's terrible from a child rights perspective. There's nothing, and it will only make everything less safe in the long term. And let alone even mentioning the burden on, our friends and allies, which Ella alluded to. So actually the only explanation, I think, for the reason for the government's continued adoption of these barely policies, but this stance of do nothing but sort of flex muscle and try to create the impression of an iron fist, is that they think it will win the votes. And what's so sad about that is that the group of people that they're doing that to, of course, there were awful crimes committed by ISIS, but we're talking about a group of people where the majority of them are children, British children. So the people at the sharp end of this tough policy that Britain has adopted without any logical justification that I can find are British children. And to inflict wanton trauma and harm on children, whatever you think of the mothers who may be associated with them, is just disgusting policy. So if you take citizenship stripping, the consequence of that, what's going to happen to the children? If let's say their mother has been stripped, maybe their sister was born after the mother was stripped, but they were born before, and now they can never live in the same country again, and the mother can't appeal, and everyone is devastated and abandoned, and they don't know what to do. And again, to that point about the documentary, they are in a total legal limbo, no access to counsel. So even if they got notice, and proper notice of citizenship stripping hasn't been being given in these cases, they have really, really difficult avenues to appeal. So it's, yes, it is the only explanation, I think, aside from a kind of wanton cruelty, which I think it is a political game, and I think they must have made the calculation that it wins votes to, bash Shamima Begum, which, frankly, she shouldn't be. We've talked about the word hysteria. She shouldn't be. We should stop obsessing over one case. This is a situation of policy and a position. We need to look at the root causes, why children left this country, ended up in a war zone, why ideology started to spread in this way, and what do we do to stop that?
That definitely is a subject for another show. I can imagine we could spend hours on that one, I know that. But Tasneem, I just wanted to bring you in on that point, I suppose, which is you can only strip somebody of their citizenship and if they're a dual national, or if there is some relationship with another country, because you can't leave somebody stateless. I mean, how can that work in reality? Because at what point do do my kids who were born here and their dad was born here, or their parents were born here, at what point can they be shipped back to Pakistan or India or whatever? It seems a little bit strange to be able to deliver on this.
Well, I mean, it goes against the idea of citizenship itself, just that depending on how long you've lived here, and Shamima Begum, as a good example, was born in the UK and had never been anywhere else before, not Bangladesh or anywhere. And she only had a UK passport. So the idea that she could be stripped is very troubling for people who are just from backgrounds similar to hers, with parents who came from somewhere else but were born here. And that's the key thing. Now, in terms of the question, who could that happen to? It depends how big a majority the Tory party have in government at any one time, because you can always change the laws to encompass more and more people as a subset.
Would this encourage people not to have dual citizenship, you think?
Well, I personally have had phone calls from people asking about advice around that. And yeah, that's one of the concerns they have, is not to have dual citizenship. But you can't, that may be a personal choice you can make for yourself, but your spouse might be somebody who comes from another country, so that you're still looking at the cleaving of families, really, even if you're making personal choices yourself.
But is it likely to happen on a number, do you think, or is it something we'll just have to keep an watchful eye on?
Well, I think the reality is that the number of people who fall within the government's sort of interest around stripping has been shown to be exponentially rising in the last couple of years. So it's not just that the laws are there, there's also the political will and the numbers coming through to show that political will to actually use this as a policy, not just as an exceptional tool.
Well, of course, we actually did approach the government to actually come on the show and to talk about this, because it's such an important subject for the audience. Unfortunately, there was nobody available, but they did give us a statement, which I'm just going to read out to you now. Removing someone's British citizenship has been possible for over a century and is a last resort against the most dangerous people or those whose conduct involves very high harm. It is rare, cannot leave anyone stateless, and comes with a right to appeal. This change is simply about the process of notification for removal of citizenship. We will always try to tell them that their citizenship has been deprived, but it might not be possible in exceptional circumstances, like if they're in a war zone, we can't get hold of them, or informing them would reveal sensitive intelligence sources. Ella, I mean, can you do something as simple as that? Get rid of someone's citizenship and just say, well, we tried to contact you, but we just couldn't get around to it, or we just couldn't find you. It seems like this is really, really big. Yet that response, which is, some of it makes a lot of sense, but some of it also, like the last bit about, well, if we can't get through to you, well, we'll just leave a voicemail message or something. It seems a bit frivolous.
Well, it is incredibly frivolous. And to bring back up Windrush was, we've got so much now information on how the Home Office mishandled so many of the Windrush claimants' cases. And we know that happened time and again, where it was kind of, like, I've lost your file, I don't know who you are. That was part of that. I said, use the term the evils of bureaucracy. It was just when you have a system that is failing in the way that we know that the Home Office departments have been, then people slip through the cracks. But I think it's not just, it would be to let the Home Office off the hook to say that this was just a kind of office screw up, and that all we need is sort of like tighter filing and to be able to properly contact people. Because I think Taz mentioned it, and you mentioned it at the start about the idea of how the notion of citizenship has changed. Because I think part of the problem is that our concept of and our valuing of citizenship has been hollowed out. And there are two elements to that. I mean, on the one hand, you have, it's quite remarkable that, not to get too hung up on Shamima Begum, as Maya says, but it's quite remarkable that you have Sajid Javid and other ministers proudly boasting about the fact that they have stripped citizenship off an individual with no kind of concept really of what precedent that sets. Never mind what you think about Shamima Begum, but the actions that she did or did not take, we're not very clear on that. The setting a precedent of being able to strip citizenship like that should frighten people, but it also should ask a question of, for us, some soul searching of what do we think being a British citizen means. It's not just a technical process. It should be something that's loaded with value, with meaning. What are the British values that we take up? I'd like them to be tolerance, freedom of speech, democracy, some big ideas that we get people to sign up to and agree. When you become a citizen of a nation, you become part of a community. And that, we're in danger of that sounding a bit like Kumbaya and airy fairy at the moment, because we don't have that political weight behind the idea of citizenship anymore. And I think that's also a problem. When you were talking about how to deal with Islamist extremism, or whatever the problem is, part of that issue is that we've lost a sense of what it's truly special about being a British citizen. And I'm afraid if we're talking about how to tackle radicalization or extremism, which I think is sort of what the government's trying to do here, trying to posture to say that it's doing something serious about it. One way to definitely not do that is to prove that we are not a free and tolerant society, that we are not liberal, that we do not hold values like democracy and citizenship dear to our heart. And doing this kind of thing is proof of that.
Oh, it definitely feels like that, doesn't it? I mean, Tasneem, do you think Muslims are being targeted?
Well, it certainly is the case. I mean, the statistics show that 50% of all hate crimes are religiously targeted towards Muslims in the last couple of years now. So there's statistics to bear that out. But part of that as well is that we've started to lose trust in our institutions, because our institutions are demonstrably not being honest with us. So again, harking back to Shamima Begum, we have a government that says, here's a young woman who's so much of a threat, as they framed it, that she can't be allowed to come back to the UK. But at exactly the same time, you have the same government trotting off to Libya, try and pick up Salman Abedi's brother, who's known to be a person now who murdered 22 people in the Ariana Grande attack. Certainly, Shamim Begum's not accused of anything like that. And then overcoming diplomatic resistance, spending treasure and time to get that person into the UK and tried in UK courts. Exactly the same time. So,
but in terms of the Nationality and Borders Bill, do you think that there is some kind of behind all of this? There is some, as many. I mean, I'm not saying whether I believe it or you believe it, but there are some people who would say that Muslims are being targeted specifically with regards to this bill.
Well, I mean, everyone who has come within the purview of that bill has been from a particular community, and that's unarguable.
And would you say, Ella, that does this show the government being slightly out of touch?
Well, it's a really interesting question, because I think Maya mentioned, whether or not this is going to win votes. And the thing that people forget is that, and certainly the government's forgotten it, is that we have never had a open and serious discussion about immigration. You know, for someone like me who wants a far more liberal immigration system, far more open arrangement and allowing more people in, it's very rare that I ever get to have that argument, in the same way that it's actually quite difficult for people who want closed borders and less immigration to have the discussion, because they get called racist. And what you end up having is a characterization on both sides of, you know, someone like me is just you know, some kind of frivolent open borders type, and the other side is a racist. And actually most people are somewhere in the middle. There's, you know, in particular, I'm kind of hung up on the Windrush scandal because it enraged me so much, but polling after that whole thing came out about the hostile environment and the evils behind that, polling showed that the vast majority of British people were, you know, thought that was abhorrent, thought it was a complete mistake by the government, were completely against the government on what they'd done there. So you've got this funny situation in which I think post-Brexit, because there's been this characterization of Brexit as this sort of anti-immigrant spurt of rage, the government's thought, how can we curry a bit of favor here? I know, let's crack down, you know, law and order type, let's crack down on immigration. And actually that's not what people want. It's just a, you know, really small point, but it's kind of interesting to note. We keep having these simultaneous discussions about, you know, we've just had an energy crisis or an HGV driver shortage, and the government starts saying, oh, we need labour from elsewhere, you know, and everyone says, open up, relax the immigration rules. Let's have a few more Eastern Europeans in here to drive our lorries. But then at the same time, when you have people come, you know, young men washing up on our borders in dinghies, people who are, you know, here who are refugees, but also people who are economic migrants, that kind of immigrant is no good. You know, we never hear about getting HGV drivers from Libya or from Iraq or from Afghanistan. There's a real, I think it's a hangover from the European Union policy of the single market, which is that there is a element of, you know, some kind of underlying preference here, whether you want to call it racism, but there is a resistance to a certain kind of immigrant. And until we have that discussion and lay it all out on the table, all you will have is characterizations on both sides, and you never get anywhere.
No, it is. You're right. You make some really good points there, Ella, about definitely people pick and choose which particular bits of immigration they want. Maya, just finishing off with you now, actually, obviously, in terms of where the bill is in terms of the parliamentary process, what's next, and do you expect it to actually get through?
Oh gosh, that I could make more money if I were good at predictions like this.
Well, if you can do it in a minute.
1 minute, okay. There are various amendments that have been put forward on the bill that are being discussed and will be voted on. I think it will go through in some form. I am hopeful there will be a lot of debate, and potentially one of the amendments that removes some of the toxic, most draconian provisions will be voted on, but we shall see. So
it's obviously got its third reading, and then it will have to go to the House of Lords and all those kind of, and I presume there'll be more, I should say, more robust conversations in the House of Lords than we may have seen in Commons, would you say?
Yeah, I think there will be. There's been a lot of attention on this now, and I think it's actually really interesting and I think heartening that this issue has now garnered a lot of public interest, if not, you know, uniformly supportive of the concerns that have been raised actually in this discussion.
Well,
but
I suppose I'm going to have to keep this. I'm going to have to bring this discussion to a close now. Even though I know we could have talked a lot more, and I think, as Ella said, there's a conversation to be had on immigration as well at some point. But I'd just like to thank you, Ella, Maya, and Tasneem, and obviously the viewers at home as well. Thank you for joining us here. If you want to actually read more about the latest news, visit our website as well at islamchannel.tv. But otherwise, we'll see you next week at 9 p.m. for another episode of News Talk. Till then, Assalamu alaikum.